into the scapular stuff now.
Yeah.
Scapular mobility, scapular hypomobility. There is the potential for post-traumatic scarring and stuff like that. It's not very common. Same thing with like bony anomalies that may produce some of these things, but muscle hypertonus will be probably your biggest nemesis as far as scapular mobility goes. So we've got, just on here right now, we've got 5 different forces acting on this scapula, so we're looking at it from the posterior side here. What I want to do is go through and have you guys pick out what the muscles are and what the spinal segmental innervation of those is.
Without your notes.
Yeah.
To say it to you or?
Okay, let's start.
Levator, would be there.
Okay.
C,
4, 5.
4, 5, or 3, 4.
3, 4.
3, 4. Everybody get that?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Elevator.
So C3-4 inculpates which 2 spinal levels? Where do they come out of? Which 2 spinal segments? 2, 3, and 3, 4. There you go. Okay. What are we looking at here? And this is actually a little bit more.
Rhomboid.
Rhomboids.
5.
4, 5. Yep. This one here. Okay. Let's hear somebody else tell me what it is. Lat. Okay. Good. Which is? It's
5.
well, but it's still. It's C6 is really what it's going to be. Okay. And yes, it's actually no, it's not.
No.
There you go. I like it. All right. Okay, so this one here.
Serratus.
Which one?
Anterior.
All right, there we go. Innervation.
6, 7.
6, 7. Okay. And this is where this becomes almost a little complicated, and I'm not going to get terribly into it, but when you look at lower serratus, we look mostly at C6. When you're getting into these things of upper serratus, you almost get more of the slip from C7, and they don't, unless you're truly protracting the shoulder, they don't work together very much. In fact, functionally, they almost oppose each other. And we'll get into that here a little more in a second. So what would this one be? And it's really more of an up and over as opposed to just an up.
5.
Okay.
Okay. Minor, there we go. Which is
7, 8.
getting closer.
It's great, but it's C9.
Yes.
C9.
Great, C9.
Class dismissed.
8T1 is what I tend to think of it as. Do you guys have 7, 8, 1, basically?
8.
Okay, and then if you wanted to add in the idea of the traps as basically the prime functional movers into overhead reach, we're looking at spinal accessory. Okay, so the reason I wanted to put this up here is because we essentially have input around the scapular system, everywhere from cranial nerve at the accessory all the way down to T1. And the nice thing is, these are all different, except for the lats and serratus, but those actually work in opposite directions. So when you start to pick up on different dyskinesias around the scapula here, it'll point you in the direction in the cervical spine as well. So it should all correlate. I wouldn't recommend going directly here and looking for the hypertonus and that sort of thing. Do your cervical scan like you should, but it should correlate with where you end up with as far as your hypertonicities and those sort of things, as far as the actual extensibility of these muscles. And that's really what you're looking for, is a lack of ability of these muscles to lengthen. And that's where you'll end up with trouble. When you're looking at her, and I'm looking at her left side, which conveniently we have here, she's already twisted up like that. So her medial border here, or medial angle, is already well elevated. And that's why when we ended up looking at her sulcus sign in sitting was positive, but when Gail laid her down and fixed this, it ended up being just fine, because in sitting, she was already dumped off. So we're missing this shelf here. You can kind of pick that up a little later when you get used to these sort of patterns, but that's the sort of stuff that you can kind of get into as far as when you start to see these things. Okay? So what I want to do now, we're going to go through and we're going to show you how to test the length of each one of these. Okay? All right, come on up here.
Scapular wings.
Sure does. But that also tells us something. When we have a little laxity of serratus, we're probably looking at its functional antagonist being quite tight. So, if we start just at the top, and we're going to kind of go in a clockwise direction here, we'll start with levator. So levator, C1 transverse process down to this medial angle here. What we're going to want to try and do is, without pulling her all the way forward, boy, there he is already, this diagonal toward me. Okay, so inferior and around the front of the thoracic cage. Right there. She's not terrible here, but I bet if we checked her other side, it would be. And actually, why don't we do that so I can show you guys the difference here. So that's not awful. Let's flip you to the other end here.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the whole thing right there. So that's pretty gnarly when you look at it.
And we found a C3-4 laxity in her neck.
Yep, we talked about that a little bit just right before lunch. So, okay, so that's that one. These are basically, if you start to think about them like this, these are diagonals essentially when we get to these. The cardinal planes, or the straight planes that we would look at with depression and elevation, retraction, and protraction, are really going to be much more about the articular motion of the SC joint, okay, versus these musculatures here. So with the rhomboids actually do have a slight posterolateral or posterior inferior, I'm running out of words here,
Angle.
lateral and inferior from the spine down this direction, right? It's somewhat similar, but we're going to try and draw her forward as well, looking for tension there. Okay. When we get to the lats, what we want to do is come anterior and superior here. Draw her up and forward. Okay, that one's not bad. Serratus anterior. I'm going to want to come on the inferior angle of the scapula here. Superior and posterior. Okay. Pec minor. I'm actually going to come across here and hold her here, but it's basically we need to come up and over like that. Okay, so if you want to think of it as that sort of motion. She's a little tight there too, but most people will be. Okay. There is one more, and I'll show you this on her, but it's not up there because it's on the opposite side of the scapula, is the upper serratus. And the upper serratus that Gail was talking about earlier will a lot of times give you that trigger point up through here that people think is the trap, or people will think is the levator scap, but it's actually that attachment of the upper serratus. Like I said, upper serratus, I tend to think of it more as a C7 slip because it does have generally a different function as far as that compared to the lower serratus. Lower serratus is going to want to pull this down and around, so it's actually a scapular abductor, aids in elevation. Upper serratus coming in this direction is actually going to tether this and prevent that. Okay, so when we're looking at that, they actually do tend to oppose each other in that sort of functional manner. Okay? So to test this one, I'll bring her up to here, get on this inside portion of the scapula here, and what I want to do is try and take that medial scapular angle away from the trunk.
Tip.
So it's almost like I'm pivoting between here and her SC joint. I'm trying to bring that down and back. That makes sense enough, actually. It's not too bad. So, not only can we use this as a way to pick out where some of these hypertonicities are coming from and kind of give us a target, as far as the cervical spine, what's actually affecting the scapular mechanics, we can also use these as a way of stretching these muscles too. Okay, so after we go in and we do our work in the cervical spine, one of the better things to do is, because then you've gotten that neurophysiological reaction to down ramp that tone. We talked about that in the past, yes? We can go directly in and we can say, okay, her levator, let's just say her pec is tight, so that's where we're at right now. We can bring her into this position and I can say, don't let me push it back. And then work into that range. Okay? And you can do that with any of these. Don't let me push it back and up. Relax. There we go. I don't think I've ever used that one as far as low serratus goes, but you can do those sort of things if you have somebody that has had a fractured rib and okay? Good on the process of that sort of stuff?
Yes.
All right, let's try it out.